Okay, so before we get started, does anybody have any questions about anything? Any questions about assignments? Any questions about readings? Any questions about whatever? No? All right, great. So, for next time, you're going to be reading the excerpt from Aristotle's Rhetoric in Reading the World. And I'm just going to warn you, right, it's short, right? It's a short excerpt. The part you have to read is only about maybe 4 pages with some questions at the end. But Aristotle is dry. So it's not going to be a particularly entertaining read. So you are probably going to have to find some way to amuse yourself with the reading, right? Like, look for some kind of interesting thread or set of oppositions as you're reading that can give you something to hang on to. Otherwise, you will likely find yourself getting sleepy as you read this. As I'm sure, as I already know what happened with some of you with Plato, right? Okay. So let's start from the position of sort of like basic definition of terms here, right? So what this particular text is concerned with is rhetoric. What is rhetoric? How would you guys define rhetoric?
Isn't it like Ethos, Pathos, isn't it? Like
That's part of it.
how you use words, like the use of words.
Yeah, part of what the whole piece is trying to do is get Gorgias to define what it is. Like, he says he's a teacher of rhetoric, right? So Plato was trying to get him to define, so okay, what the hell is rhetoric, right? So, yeah, we tend to think of rhetoric as having to do with words. And that certainly seems to be a definition that Plato and Gorgias agree on, right? What other associations do you have with the word rhetoric? What is the basic purpose of rhetoric? And this doesn't have to come from Plato here. I mean, this can just come from your own experience, your own heads, right?
Every time I hear rhetoric, I just think of rhetorical question, like rhetorical.
Okay. Yeah, so let's maybe start from there and break it down, right? What's a rhetorical question?
Like a question that's not meant to be answered.
Yeah. It's a question that you pose, right? That you don't intend for the listener to answer, and that you don't actually intend to answer yourself, right? So then why do you ask a rhetorical question?
It gets you thinking. Like, if I ever see one, I would be wondering, so what's he thinking? Or it'd make me think while I was reading.
Uh-huh. Okay, so it can spur thinking on a particular issue, right?
Mm-hmm.
What were you saying, Gia?
It can make someone feel stupid. Like, it can make them, like, feel dumb.
Uh-huh. Okay, maybe the question is not being answered because the answers should be so obvious, right?
Right.
But the reason we call this as a rhetorical question is because it's actually a kind of persuasion trick. So, if I am trying to say, okay, so let's assume for the moment that, I am an ancient Greek general and you are soldiers, right? And I'm trying to psych you up for a battle, and I say, like, are we not twice the warriors the Spartans are, right? That's a rhetorical question, right? I'm not going to answer the question. And you're not really supposed to answer the question either, but the answer is assumed, right? They're like, no, of course we are twice the warriors the Spartans are, right? So it's often meant to persuade you to do something or to persuade you to think something, right? So rhetoric really is primarily about persuasion. Now, the rhetoric that Plato and Gorgias are talking about is concerned primarily with language, right? But we can use images to persuade as well, right? A billboard advertisement, right, is intended to persuade you to purchase a particular product or to patronize a particular establishment, right? It's calculated in some way to persuade you to do something. We're going to be focused mostly on verbal rhetoric because we're focused mostly on words in this class anyway, words and text, right? But yeah, what we're going to be talking about here primarily when we look at Plato and then we look at Aristotle is what they have to say about the means of persuasion and the way we use those means of persuasion, right? So I think what you were talking about, Ariel, when you mentioned logos, ethos, and pathos. Yeah, these are means of persuasion, right? Things that you use to persuade someone. Does anybody know what these terms mean? What logos, pathos, and ethos are?
There are appeals, like logical appeal.
Yeah.
Emotional.
Yeah, we have logos, the appeal to reason. Pathos is the appeal to emotion. And what's ethos?
Isn't that ethical?
Yeah, it's the root word of our word ethical, right? So if we say that someone is ethical, what are we saying about them?
They have morals.
Like they're relating to us.
Well, okay, yeah, I think Ariel is on the right track when she talks about morals, right? Although morals are more kind of like internal guiding principles, and ethics are more kind of like rules, right?
Well, like the first thing I think of is like the code of ethics for teachers.
Yeah.
Because like the first thing I thought of was like ethics and ethical.
Yeah. There's a code of ethics for teachers. There's a code of ethics for physicians, right? So there's a code of ethics for lawyers, right? So most professions have a code of ethics that are designed to keep people honest, right? To keep people from doing things that are unscrupulous. And this is because ethos specifically is the appeal to character, right? To the good character, the good reputation of the person doing the persuading, right? So logos, appeal to reason, right? The use of, facts and data, things like that in argument, right? Pathos, the appeal to emotion, right? Getting your audience to feel something as you're speaking, right? So, using, illustrative stories that wrench the heartstrings. Even telling a joke, right, is an example of pathos. Ethos, demonstrating that you are a person of good character, who is knowledgeable, and has the standing to speak on this issue, right? So, most uses of language are in some sense rhetorical, right? Even if they're not explicitly trying to get you to do or believe something. And it's helpful sometimes to pick apart exactly how a particular sentence operates rhetorically. So, for example, I write this on the whiteboard every day, right? When you come in, to remind you to do a particular thing, right? What elements of this sentence are not strictly necessary for me to get you to do the thing I want you to do?
Please.
Remember to.
Yeah, please remember to, right?
And thanks.
And I don't have to thank you, right?
Just like,
Yeah, I mean, I can just say that this is my rule, follow it, right? Why don't I?
This is rude.
Yeah, because to command you to do something, even if I am the authority figure in the room, might come off as rude, right? And if I come off as rude,
I won't listen.
yeah, or if you do listen, you'll do so grudgingly, right? If I'm simply forcing you to do something, or if you feel like I'm simply forcing you to do something, you're less likely to want to cooperate, right? Whereas at least if I'm polite about it, right, then it feels less coercive. It doesn't make me seem like quite as much of a jerk, I hope, right? And we do this kind of thing all the time. Yeah, politeness is rhetorical, right? We don't have to be polite to get what we want, but we do it because it helps us to persuade others. Now, rhetoric as a formal system comes out of a particular set of historical and political circumstances, right? So, Plato is writing in the early 4th century BCE, after the city-state of Athens, in which he resides, has been through a political experiment that, as far as we know, had no precedent in the ancient world, right? So what do we know, if anything, about the government of Athens in the 5th century BCE? If we've studied the politics of the ancient world, or if we've done ancient Greece and Western City, right? Do you remember anything specific about what politics looked like in ancient Athens?
They were very aggressive in their negotiations.
Okay, they may have been very aggressive in the negotiations, right? But in terms of their particular political system, right? What political system did they use?
Was it like
Live.
a council, or like where one would stand in the middle, surrounded by other people,
Uh-huh.
like a parliament or something?
Yeah, you're thinking along the right lines here. Right? Yeah, so Athens was ruled by a form of direct democracy.
I just think of the movie 300.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, you've probably seen this depicted in movies, right? If you've seen any of those like sword and sandal type epics, where you've got, that take place in ancient Greece, right? There's probably a bunch of people in outfits that look like togas, right, sitting around debating something, right? Now, this was unique to Athens and to city-states that were kind of clients of Athens, right, that were connected to Athens. This was not the state in all of Greece, right? And even in Athens, this only lasted a relatively short time. But what this meant was that every male citizen of a certain age who was not a slave had a vote on any issues of public consequence, right? So, do we go to war with Sparta? Everybody gets a vote, right? Do we impose taxes on trade with Corinth, right? Everybody gets a vote. Do we execute Socrates for corrupting the youth? Everybody gets a vote. And so, with a system like this, where there are no appointed or hereditary leaders, how do you get people to follow a particular course of action?
Make them think it was their horse.
Okay, yeah. You can, make them think it was their idea, right? But basically what you have to do is persuade them, right? So a whole school arises of thinkers and itinerant teachers who essentially teach young, wealthy men how to speak persuasively. So the art they teach is rhetoric. And the teachers of said art call themselves sophists. Sophia in Greek means wisdom, so a sophist literally is a wise one. And sophists taught all kinds of tricks, right? They taught you not just what sorts of arguments to make and how to construct a good argument, but also what sorts of gestures you should make while you were speaking, what kind of stance was most persuasive when you were speaking on particular issues, how to pitch your voice, all kinds of things, right? Anything that was designed to try to make you a more persuasive speaker and help you to win your point. Now, we don't have many of their writings. Very few of their writings have actually survived, right? But one thing that the sophists seemed to agree on was that it is impossible for human beings to know absolute truth. That if there is such a thing as absolute truth, we can't actually get there. We can't actually reach it or comprehend it. So, the best we can do, right, the closest we can come to truth is creating belief through persuasive argument. Right? The most persuasive argument, the logic here goes, is probably going to be closest to the truth. So, this is as near as we're going to be able to get. Right? We have dueling speakers, battle it out, and whoever's most persuasive, that's who we're going to go with, right? Some of these sophists claimed that they could teach people to argue both sides or multiple sides of a particular issue, and also sometimes claimed that they could make the weaker side of an argument actually appear stronger. So they really got under the skin of philosophers like Plato. Now, are any of you familiar at all with Plato? Ariel, you said that you guys are reading The Republic right now in political science. Anybody else know anything about Plato? Or is this your first encounter with him? What's that?
I've read through Socrates' Politics.
Okay.
I know of him.
Okay, you know of him. Yeah, for most of us, it's at the very least a name we've heard, right? Even if we've never actually read his work. Or, oh, hey, this just came apart. Great. Even if we've never actually read his work or thought too deeply about him, right? So, those of you who have read Plato, who know something about Plato, what do you know about his basic beliefs?
He's like a philosopher that believes solely basically what his family, what he grew up on, kind of. And like what he was taught by people around him.
Okay, can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Kind of. So like he believes like, so what the government is doing is wrong, kind of.
Okay.
And that, I don't know how to explain
Yeah.
exactly what he believes.
Well, yeah, Plato doesn't like democracy,
Yeah.
right? He thinks that democracy is a messy system that is too easily overtaken by unscrupulous people who are able to speak well and sway the masses to their way of thinking, right? It is really warm in here, right? It's not just me?
No, it is one.
Okay, all right. Good.
Great, isn't it?
Now, stay. That's neutral.
Okay.
Comfortable.
It's colder than it normally is when it's warm, but it's warmer than it normally is when it's cold.
Okay, I guess, yeah, like just with things being what they are, I'm a little bit super sensitive to changes in temperature, you know, it's like, you know,
Hot
just,
flash.
yeah.
Start with Philly.
All right, so, yeah, so Plato's not a fan of democracy for the reasons we just spelled out here, right? Anything else that you know about Plato, that you remember about Plato?
He like grew up wealthy.
Okay, yeah, he's from an aristocratic family. In terms of his basic beliefs, have you done the Allegory of the Cave yet?
Not yet.
Okay. So, in a famous piece in The Republic, which is his best known work, it's his big work on politics, Plato tells a story, or has Socrates tell a story, about a bunch of people, prisoners, who are chained up in a cave, right? And they are so chained up that they can only face forward, right? All they can see is the back wall of the cave. And what they see on the back wall of this cave are essentially shadow puppets, right? They see these images, these shadows flickering back and forth on the back of the cage, right? So, I have no idea how to draw this, so we'll just write there, shadow puppets. Now, unbeknownst to the prisoners, these images are being created by some guys on a walkway up above them who have a fire up here, and they're just walking back and forth holding these objects. You know, look like a bull or a dog or what have you. And so what the prisoners are seeing are the shadows of these puppets, these objects, on the back wall. Now behind these figures up on the platform is the exit from which emanates light, right? So what happens then if one of the prisoners somehow manages to get free? Right? He busts out of his chains Incredible Hulk style, and he makes a run for the exit. Yay, freedom, right? But when he gets out into the light, it's too bright. It hurts his eyes, and it's hard for him to adjust because he spent his whole life in a dark cave. Eventually, like with time, his vision will adjust, and he'll see things as they really are outside the cave. And then, if he returns to the cave to tell the others what's out there, right, there's a whole world out there. How do you think the others respond?
Yeah, there's not.
Yeah. They're like, you're full of shit, right? All there is the cave, and all that matters are these images on the back wall, because that's all they know. So the cave and this back wall is the world of our senses, right? The world that we are able to directly sense. And the point that Plato is trying to make here is that our senses are unreliable and easily manipulated. And the higher reality of ideas, right, the world of the mind, is much harder for us to reach and to comprehend. Right. So much so that once we do get there, it's really hard to bring others along with us because they want to stick with what they know. So everything in this world of our senses is just an imitation of some idea from the world of the mind, right? So how is it, for example, that we're able to build a table like this one? Right? This physical table is just an imitation of an idea of a table, right? Everything in the physical, sensible world is an imitation of what Plato calls an ideal form. Right? Our senses basically create impressions in the world for us of these that conform to these ideas, right? We can only comprehend what the thing is or recreate the thing if we start from an idea. So the things that are most real for Plato are things of the mind, ideas, right? And everything in the physical world is just an inferior copy of an idea. Everybody with me? Anybody confused? Good. So Plato is coming at this from the position that rhetoric is an inferior copy of philosophy.
So he's saying like it's the ideal form?
Yeah, that philosophy is the ideal form, right? And that rhetoric is the inferior copy in the world of the senses. And there's a part of the Gorgias that's not excerpted here that we don't have, right? Where Socrates is listing all of these, arts and how they compare to each other, right? That there's a true art and a false art. So, for example, rhetoric is the false form of philosophy. Cookery is the false form of medicine, right? You're just feeding the body tasty things instead of doing what you need to make it well. Cosmetics is the false form of gymnastics, right? Instead of making the body beautiful through exercise and effort, you're making the body beautiful by painting it, right? So do we understand how this operates now? And on what level Socrates is arguing? Okay, so let's then try and start digging into the dialogue a little bit. Where do you guys want to start with this? I know from conversation at the beginning of class, I know that a couple of you found this frustrating for various reasons. But do you have some sense, at least now, of why Socrates is pressing these particular examples on Gorgias, given the way Plato sees the world? What seems to be the first task that Socrates wants to accomplish here in his dialogue with Gorgias? What's the first thing he wants to do, or that he wants Gorgias to do? Yeah. Almost, more than half of this is taken up with just trying to get Gorgias to define what he's talking about, right? So through discussion, what they're trying to do is come to a definition of rhetoric that they can both agree on, right? So take a minute, look back through this, and tell me what Gorgias' first definition of rhetoric is. On page 122, what's the first thing Gorgias says rhetoric is?
His art.
Okay, it's his art. But then how does he explain his art? What does Gorgias say rhetoric is concerned with?
Discourse.
Yeah. So, rhetoric is the art which is concerned with discourse, right? So does everybody understand what he means by discourse, what discourse is here? Okay, so discourse right, is language, specifically a discussion and argument. And this is one of those moments where Plato is trying to lead Gorgias on through using examples, right? So what are the examples that he uses to try to get Gorgias to explain what he wants him to get Gorgias to say what he wants?
You ask him about music.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Very good, then, as you profess to be a rhetorician and a maker of rhetoricians, let me ask you, with what is rhetoric concerned? I might ask, with what is weaving concerned? And you would reply, would you not, with the making of garments? Yes. And music is concerned with the composition of melodies? It is. So what do weaving and music have in common with each other?
They're both forms of like art, kind of, or like, I guess, expression.
Yeah, they can both be forms of expression, right? Although weaving is a little bit more pragmatic, yeah? How is Socrates bringing these two things together? What is he essentially asking Gorgias here?
Like the basic definitions of music and making garments.
Uh-huh. So yeah, so weaving is the making of garments, right? Music is the composition of melodies, right? So what is Socrates saying, like, what's Socrates' basis for comparison here? How is a musician like a weaver? Think about these words making and composition.
They both make something.
Yeah, they both make something, right? And so then what does Socrates want to know from Gorgias?
What does rhetoric make?
Yeah, what does a rhetorician make, right? What do you actually create? So first, he mentions something you can create that's tangible, right? An actual tangible physical object. Okay, a weaver makes a garment. Then something that is intangible but is still made, right? A melody. And then, okay, so what do you, Gorgias, make? And Gorgias says, discourse, right? Language. I make language. Now, how satisfied is Socrates with this definition?
Not very much so.
Why not? What's wrong with it?
It's too vague.
Yeah, it's super vague, right? What specifically does Socrates find too vague about it?
He doesn't know like what kind of discourse.
Uh-huh.
He doesn't know like what type of discourse you would apply to like the situation, like the sick under what treatment they might get wrong.
Yeah. So what he's pointing out here, right, is that every art or science involves language in some way, right? Virtually every art or science involves persuasion in some way. So what is it that makes rhetoric different, right? What is it that makes rhetoric different from mathematics or from medicine or from gymnastic, right? How is your art different from others that use language? And then what's Gorgias' response? It might also help if we think here for a second, just because we're looking for strands, right? We're looking for threads. The two examples that Socrates uses on page 123 here, right, when he's talking about discourse, he talks about medicine and gymnastic. What do these both have in common?
With your health.
Yeah, with the health of the body, right? Good. All right. So when Socrates asks, right, then why, if you call the art which treats of discourse, if you call rhetoric the art which treats of discourse, and all the other arts treat of discourse, do you not call them arts of rhetoric? Because, Socrates, the knowledge of the other arts has only to do with some sort of external action, as of the hand. But there is no such action of the hand in rhetoric, which works and takes effect only through the medium of discourse. And therefore I am justified in saying that rhetoric treats of discourse. So how is he saying rhetoric is different from medicine and gymnastic?
Because you actually do stuff with your hands, like you're actually doing something.
Yeah, there's no act, yeah.
Just moving your mouth and talking.
Yeah, there's no physical action, he says, connected to rhetoric, right? Yeah, there's no physical action. It's solely performed through language. And why is this definition also unsatisfactory?
Because all art has language.
Yeah, all arts do include language, right? But then if we look at Socrates' counter-argument here below, right? There are other arts which work wholly through the medium of language and require either no action or very little, as for example the arts of arithmetic, of calculation, of geometry, and of playing draughts. In some of these, speech is pretty nearly coextensive with action, but in most of them the verbal element is greater. They depend wholly on words for their efficacy and power, and I take your meaning to be that rhetoric is an art of this latter sort. So arithmetic, calculation, geometry, what are we talking about here?
Math.
Yeah, he's talking about math, right? And why might math be a good counterexample for talking about early? What do the sophists not believe in? What do people like Gorgias not believe in?
Numbers? Question mark?
No, they believe in numbers. They can count, right? But if we look again at like the sophists' beliefs here, right? What do the sophists not believe in?
The teaching of numbers? Question mark?
Right. It's like I know what you're saying, but I don't know how to.
Like science? Like, kind of like science?
Oh, do they not believe in like the absolute truth?
Yeah, the sophists don't believe it's
Oh.
possible for human beings to know absolute truth, right?
So like 2 + 2 is 4 is like an absolute truth, and they
Yeah.
believe that?
Yeah, well, yep. And I think,
That doesn't make any sense.
but I think that's exactly, it's probably what Socrates is thinking as he's leading him along here, right? is that mathematics actually does deal in absolute truth, right? There are right answers and there are wrong answers. There's a right way to calculate something, there's a wrong way to calculate something. There's a right way to measure, the area of a field, and a wrong way to do it, right? So he is trying to trap Gorgias here by getting him to compare his art, which creates only belief, to other arts that use language that actually do produce absolute truth, right? And this is the big difference, as Plato sees it, between a sophist and a philosopher, right? That a philosopher is only interested in truth. This is what occasions their big argument at the end of this piece, or the end of this excerpt, right? The only thing Socrates gives a shit about is the truth. Not about belief, not about persuasion. And so using mathematics as a kind of analogy here, right? Right, it's, it's all part of drawing Gorgias out and giving him enough rope to hang himself, right? So, when Gorgias does come to a definition of rhetoric which they can both accept, what is it? What does he claim on page 125 the rhetorician gives to his students?
Freedom in their own persons.
Yep. That good, Socrates, which is truly the greatest, being that which gives to men freedom in their own persons, and to individuals the power of ruling over others in their several states. Okay, so he's claiming that what he teaches gives freedom and what else?
Power.
Freedom and power, right? But Socrates still isn't satisfied here, right? And what would you consider this to be? And what is the thing that gives freedom and power? What is there greater than the word which persuades the judges in the courts, or the senators in the council, or the citizens in the assembly, or any other political meeting? Right? Rhetorical question, right? To go back to the beginning of class. What he is saying here, what he means, is that the word that persuades is the greatest power, right? If you have the power of uttering this word, you will have the physician your slave, and the trainer your slave, and the moneymaker of whom you talk will be found to gather treasures not for himself, but for you who are able to speak and to persuade the multitude. So what the rhetorician teaches, right, what his actual art is, what he actually makes is persuasive language, right? Is there anything about the way Gorgias phrases this that sounds kind of creepy or unscrupulous? Think about what he claims to be able to do for you, or what he claims to be able to give you.
Like where he says about making the physician your slave.
Yeah. Making these practitioners of these other arts work for you, right? Giving you power over all of them. Even though, as Socrates likes to point out, right, they know shit and you don't. Right. To follow up on that, Right? Socrates responds here after they come to their mutual definition. Then hear me, Gorgias, for I am quite sure that if there was ever a man who entered on a discussion of a matter from a pure love of knowing the truth, I am such a one, and I should say the same of you. Gorgias responds, what is coming, Socrates? Like, almost like he knows that Socrates is trying to set him up, right? I will tell you, I am very well aware that I do not know what, according to you, is the exact nature, or what are the topics of that persuasion of which you speak, and which is given by rhetoric, although I have a suspicion about both the one and the other. And I am going to ask, what is this power of persuasion which is given by rhetoric, and about what? But why, if I have a suspicion, do I ask instead of telling you? Not for your sake, but in order that the argument may proceed in such a manner as is most likely to set forth the truth. What's the word that Socrates keeps harping on? Right, throughout so many of his questions to Gorgias, what word does he keep coming back to?
The truth.
Truth, yeah. Right, pointing out again that essential dichotomy in their beliefs, right? There is a truth versus belief binary here, with Socrates on the truth side and Gorgias on the belief side. Right. And I would have you observe that I am right in asking this further question. If I asked, what sort of a painter is Zeuxis, and you said, the painter of figures, should I not be right in asking what kind of figures and where do you find them? Certainly. And for this reason, the reason for asking this second question would be that there are other painters besides who paint many other figures. True. But if there had been no one but Zeuxis who painted them, then you would have answered quite well. Quite so. Now I want to know about rhetoric in the same way. Is rhetoric the only art which brings persuasion, or do other arts have the same effect? I mean to say, does he who teaches anything persuade men of that which he teaches or not? So in addition to discourse operating in all of these different arts and sciences, right? How else is Socrates suggesting all arts contain persuasion? What do I have to do if I want you to learn something?
He teaches.
I have to teach you, right?
And try to persuade us that it's correct.
Yeah, I have to persuade you that it's correct, right? Or that that it's worth knowing. Right? Or maybe 50-50 on some of that, right? But yeah, the point he's trying to make here, right, is that teaching isn't just about giving people information. It's about persuading them to listen to you, and about persuading them the information that you have to share with them is actually worth knowing. That your version of the truth is actually worth communicating. And Gorgias professes to be a teacher, right? He's a teacher of rhetoric. But teachers of all types have to do a lot of convincing, right? Is ethos, the whole idea of good character and good reputation is a big part of successfully teaching. So when we narrow this down a little bit further, what do we get? If we keep thinking about these along these lines of truth and belief being the competing values here. If we look on page 127, what's the back and forth that Socrates and Gorgias get into here?
Believing and learning versus learning.
Yeah, having learned the same as having believed, and are learning and belief the same thing? In my judgment, Socrates, they are not the same. And your judgment is right, as you may ascertain in this way. If a person were to say to you, is there, Gorgias, a false belief as well as a true, you would reply, if I am not mistaken, that there is. Yes. Well, but is there a false knowledge as well as a true? No. No, indeed. And this again proves that knowledge and belief differ. So what's the difference between knowledge and belief? As Socrates puts it here.
You can have a false belief that it can still be true.
Yeah.
You can't have false knowledge that isn't true.
Exactly. Belief is falsifiable, right? Knowledge is not, right? Knowledge is absolute. Right, at least the way Socrates sees it, or the way Plato sees it, there is no such thing as false knowledge, though there is such a thing as false belief. Now, one thing to remember here again is that, like, this is a fictional version of Gorgias that Plato has set up for his own purposes, right? The real Gorgias would probably not have agreed to this.
Like, not agree to have the interview at all.
Oh no, he likely would have agreed to have the conversation, but he would not have agreed with Socrates' distinction between knowledge and belief. Because from what we know of the historical Gorgias, he didn't believe it was possible to obtain real knowledge.
So he would have said the knowledge you have is only in belief.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. He would not have acknowledged that there's a distinction,
Got it.
right? And that what you should believe is that which is most persuasive and most convincing, right? So this is one way in which Plato is a little bit unfair to his opposing viewpoint here. The end result of this chain of reasoning, though, right, is that Gorgias once again limits his definition, right? So have we noticed that every time Socrates starts cutting in and questioning, Gorgias has to make his definition narrower and smaller? This is actually not a bad strategy for your own work, right? When you have to define something, like for example, when you were looking at the Mencius and the Sun Tzu pieces, right? One of the things that you kind of need to do as you're reading those pieces is figure out, like, what do these guys mean by human nature, right? What do they mean by good and evil? How do they define these things? And so through looking at specific passages in the text, you can figure out what, by examining patterns, what it is they actually believe and how they would define things. But what we get to here by the bottom of page 127 is that rhetoric is primarily concerned with persuasion in the courts of law and the assemblies, right? And which sort of persuasion does rhetoric create in courts of law and other assemblies about the just and unjust? The sort of persuasion which gives belief without knowledge, or that which gives knowledge? Clearly, Socrates, that which only gives belief. Then rhetoric, as would appear, is the artificer of a persuasion which creates belief about the just and the unjust, but gives no instruction about them. True. And the rhetorician does not instruct the courts of law or other assemblies about things just and unjust, but he creates belief about them. For no one can be supposed to instruct such a vast multitude about such high matters in a short time. Certainly not. Again, the idea of a court of justice here is an important part of Plato's overall strategy. What is he suggesting the rhetoricians do in a court of law?
Persuade.
And do they persuade the jury to make the right or the good or the just decision?
Yes and no.
Depending on what he's trying
Yeah.
to do.
They can, right? But they don't necessarily, right? Like, not through the nature of, like, it's not in the nature of rhetoric to teach people what's right and wrong. Only to persuade people whether what someone did was right or wrong, right? And you can argue the case either way. So, if it creates only belief, and belief is falsifiable, you can just as easily create a false belief as a true belief, right? If you're good enough. And, when we're talking about things like math and gymnastics, right, these are things that are, in the grand scheme of things, relatively trivial, right? Don't tell that to your math professors. But if we're talking about matters of justice, this is actually really important, right? If you're training people to make arguments in the courts that create false beliefs, or they can create false beliefs, this is a violation of social trust, right? This is potentially helping people get away with shit they shouldn't be allowed to get away with. Which is, again, like, well, why the particular example is chosen. Now, Socrates then goes on to point another danger. Can I get one of you to read from the bottom of page 27 what Socrates says here is that, come then and let us see what we really mean about rhetoric. Yeah, go ahead, Elizabeth.
Come then and let us see what we really mean about rhetoric. For I do not know what my own meaning is as yet. When the assembly meets to elect a physician or a shipwright or any other craftsman, will the rhetorician be taken into counsel? Surely not. For at every election he ought to be chosen who is most skilled, and again when walls have to be built or harbors or docks to be constructed, not the rhetorician, but the master workman will advise, or when generals have to be chosen in order of battle arranged or a proposition taken. Then the military will advise and not the rhetoricians. What do you say, Gorgias? Since you profess to be a rhetorician and a maker of rhetoricians, I cannot do better than learn the nature of your art from you.
Okay, thank you. You can stop there, right? So what's the issue that Socrates is pointing out here?
That they're not skilled. The only thing that you get out of a rhetorician is rhetoric.
Yeah, I mean, like, if you want to elect a state physician, right? Do you want a guy who speaks well but knows fuck all about medicine? Yeah, no, that's potentially dangerous, right? Do you want somebody who is persuasive but doesn't understand stonemasonry to build your city walls?
No.
And do you want a charismatic wacko who doesn't understand tactics leading your military?
No.
So yeah, what Socrates is trying to point out here, as Gary was saying, is that skill and expertise matter in these important public roles, right? That your skills and your knowledge are more important than your ability to persuade. And then I think it's interesting to look here at Gorgias' response. Bottom of page 128. Can I get somebody to read the last thing Gorgias says here? Starting with, a marvel indeed, Socrates. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
A marvel indeed, Socrates, if you only knew how rhetoric comprehends and holds under persuade all the inferior art. Let me offer you a striking example of this. On several occasions I have been with my brother,
Heroicus.
Herodotus.
Good enough.
something for the physician to see one of his patients who would not allow the physician to give the medicine or apply a knife or high iron to him. And I have persuaded him to do for me what he would not do for the physician just by use of rhetoric.
Okay, pause there for a second, right? So, on the one hand, this is not a terrible example, right? What is Gorgias pointing out as one of the uses of his art?
Like people who won't comply to, like say the physician, he can get him to comply with his words.
Yeah, so like if we take like a contemporary example, right? It's like somebody who, won't take a vaccine that their doctor recommends to them, right? But might listen to somebody who can speak persuasively on the advantages and safety of that vaccine, right? So this seems like a relatively harmless example of Gorgias' art, right? Now, what might be problematic here, though? Should Gorgias be advising people to take medicine or have surgery if his brother Rhetoricus, the physician, is not with him? No, right? He is acting actually as a subordinate to the person who has superior knowledge in this case, right?
Someone who's qualified.
Yeah, somebody who's actually qualified to tell people what medicine to take, right? Who's not just going to apply hot irons to people if they don't need it. So rhetoric here, the way he paints it, is actually a subordinate art, right? Now, if you can continue, please, Gary. And if I say that if a rhetorician and a physician.
Okay. I say that if a rhetorician and a physician was to go into any city and had there to argue in a scholastic,
The Ecclesia.
Euclidean, or any other assembly as to which of them should be elected state physician, the physician would have no chance. But he could speak, but he who could speak would be chosen if he wished. And in a contest with a man of any other profession, the rhetorician more than anyone would have the power of getting himself chosen, for he can speak more persuasively to the multitude than any of them, and on any subject. Such is the nature and power of the art of rhetoric.
Okay, thank you. So let's back up here for a second and remember what Plato's basic attitude towards democracy is. Does Plato think democracy is a good thing or a bad thing?
Bad.
And why does he think democracy is a bad thing?
Because it's easy to manipulate.
Yeah, because it's easy to manipulate people, right? And what is Gorgias suggesting here?
It's easy
It's
to
easy.
manipulate.
That it's really easy to manipulate people, yeah. He's basically admitting it, right? That because I can speak persuasively, like if my brother the doctor and I both went up to be elected state physician, people would vote for me. And this has been a consistent theme throughout this, right? Kind of like running through the bottom of this. That rhetoric is a system that develops out of democracy and is closely connected to participating in a democracy, right? But it's also, as Socrates' conversation with Gorgias points out, a danger to truth and knowledge, because truth and knowledge become devalued in a society that's built on belief. Now, I am not suggesting that I am anti-democracy, right? I am not trying to suggest that I agree with Plato's arguments. In fact, I think in a lot of ways the dialogue is kind of unfair to Gorgias and to the viewpoint that Gorgias represents. But we want to try to read this at least for our first run through from a sympathetic perspective, right? We're trying to like think along with the piece and see where it's making its moves and what arguments it's advancing. And then we go on to say, almost as though Gorgias has realized that he's overstepped a little bit, right? He follows by talking about the responsibilities of a teacher of rhetoric, right? Can I get somebody to read that, starting with "and yet Socrates"? Thank you, Gia.
And yet Socrates, rhetoric should be used like any other competitive art, not against everybody. The rhetorician ought not to abuse his strength any more than a pugilist
Pugilist. A pugilist is a boxer.
or pancreatist.
Yeah, I don't know what that is.
Okay, I looked it up on Google, I didn't say anything.
Yeah.
Or other master of fence, because he has powers which are more than a match either for friend or enemy. He ought not therefore to strike, stab, or slay his friends. Suppose a man to have been trained in the palestra
Mm-hmm.
and to be a skillful boxer. He, in the fullness of his strength, goes and strikes his father or mother, or one of his familiars or friends. But that is no reason why the trainers or fencing masters should be held in
Detestation.
detestation or banished from the city. Surely not. For they taught their art for a good purpose, to be used against enemies and evildoers, in self-defense, not in aggression, and others have perverted their instructions and turned to a bad use their own strength and skill.
Okay, thank you. So let's pause there for a minute. What is Gorgias comparing rhetoric to here?
Misuse of,
Pardon?
misusing rhetoric.
Well, he is talking about, students of rhetoric misusing what their teachers have taught them, right? But what arts is he comparing rhetoric to here? What do they have in common? Fencing, boxing.
Competitive.
What's that?
Competitive.
They're competitive, right?
You can use it against somebody else.
Yeah, you can use it against somebody else, right? But even on a more basic level of just what these things are about doing, right? If you're fencing or boxing, what are you doing?
In contest.
You're causing harm to another person.
Yeah, you're fighting, right?
Yeah.
So rhetoric here is compared to fighting. And Socrates didn't have to do it. Right? Gorgias made this comparison himself. That rhetoric is like fighting or dueling.
But like, fairly.
Yeah, fairly. And it should only be used, does he say it should only be used in the service of truth?
No. He says a good purpose.
A good purpose, yeah. To be used against enemies and evildoers, right?
Self-defense.
Yeah, in self-defense. And not to strike your friends, right? So he's describing it in kind of factional terms here, right? It's like, don't use it against your allies. Don't use it against your friends, right? Not so much use it to find truth. Right. If you've been taught to fight with words, if you've been taught the skill of dueling with words, then the only people you should attack are your enemies, and you should only do so in self-defense, right? Now, what is he also trying to wriggle out of here throughout this passage? Right?
The absolute truth.
The absolute truth, and also that teachers are in any way responsible for their students, right? That teachers are in any way responsible for what their students go off and do with what they've learned.
Like they're not responsible.
Yeah, Gorgias is suggesting they're not responsible, right? That the art he teaches is morally neutral. It's a skill like any other. It's a skill like boxing or fencing. And it's not to be used to harm your friends. It's not to be used for bad purposes. And the fact that I taught it to you in good faith doesn't mean that I should be blamed if you use it for a bad purpose, right? It's not the art that's bad. It's not me that's bad. It's the student that's bad. So, say, if I teach you to write persuasive essays, and one of you goes and publishes an extremely persuasive newspaper editorial that convinces, say, the president to launch a nuclear strike against Iran, by Gorgias' logic, I'm not responsible for what you did, right? You're responsible for what you did. And that there's nothing wrong with the art or with my teaching. Does Socrates seem willing to buy this? And in fact, we give Socrates the last word here, right? You, Gorgias, like myself, have had great experience of disputations, and you must have observed, I think, that they do not always terminate in mutual edification or in the definition by either party of the subjects which they are discussing. But disagreements are apt to rise. Somebody says that another has not spoken truly or clearly, and then they get into a passion and begin to quarrel, both parties conceiving that their opponents are arguing from personal feeling only and jealousy of themselves, not from any interest in the question at issue. And sometimes they will go on abusing one another until the company are at last quite vexed at themselves for ever listening to such fellows. Why do I say this? Why? Because I cannot help feeling that you are now saying what is not quite consistent or accordant with what you were saying at first about rhetoric. And I am afraid to point this out to you, lest you should think that I have some animosity against you, and that I speak not for the sake of discovering the truth, but from jealousy of you. So here is how Socrates thinks Gorgias' argument is inconsistent. That Gorgias has said that rhetoric gives the rhetorician power over people's minds, right? That the rhetorician can sway people to do whatever he or she wants them to do. And yet, the rhetorician cannot even convince his students to be good, right? The rhetorician cannot even convince his students to use what they've learned to good purpose and not for self-advancement. So I think, Gia, you had some questions before class started about how Plato sees Gorgias' argument as inconsistent. That's where it is, right? If this gives you absolute power, it should give you absolute power. Okay, so does anybody have any questions about this? So when we look at Aristotle next time, Aristotle was Plato's student, and his view of rhetoric is much closer to Gorgias's, right, as a kind of morally neutral tool. So what we're going to be seeing in Aristotle is less argumentative and a little bit more descriptive.
The definition of rhetoric, or something else?
That's part of it. Definition, proper uses, social role of things of that nature.